Wow, what a day. It's given us a tremendous amount of information to think about in terms of opportunities for transit and TNCs, and going forward, transit's roles in mass, mobility as a service, and also working with other mobility actors. To wrap up, I'm going to welcome our moderators back on stage, and with their bios, raise a few short questions just to help us wrap up. So Shirley, Andrew, Teresa, Molly, could I have you back up on stage? So just to introduce our moderators who have helped us through today, Shirley Samujh-Dayal has over 21 years of experience working in the transportation industry and has spent the last 19 years at TransLink. Now serves as the Manager of Government and Public Affairs for British Columbia's South Coast Transportation Authority, the official name of TransLink. Shirley's played a key role in a variety of high-profile projects, including leading consultation and government relations for TransLink. She resides in the township of Langley, where she commutes to TransLink's head office in New Westminster every day via Transit. Shirley believes that having high-quality transportation and transit options across Metro Vancouver is vital to the livability and economic prosperity of the region. So thanks for moderating session number 1 for us, Shirley. Teresa O'Reilly is a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. She's also a registered professional planner. She's a manager at TransLink, also Metro Vancouver's Regional Transportation Authority. She's a subject matter expert in big data, and she's been working with big data for over the past 4 years. Prior to that, planning the transit network in Metro Vancouver for close to a decade. And it was actually a month-long cycling trip in the Maritimes that piqued Teresa's interest in transportation, and she's never looked back. Andrew McCurran, thanks Andrew, originally hailed from Ontario, or Oakville, Ontario. Andrew now lives in Vancouver, BC, where he is Director of Strategic Planning and Policy at TransLink. Andrew leads the team responsible for the development of regional transportation policy, near-term and long-term range strategic plans, and the testing and piloting of new mobility services. He's also held other roles at TransLink related to transit-oriented community design, as well as infrastructure planning for roads, cycling, transit stations, and exchanges. Before joining TransLink, he held posts with UN Habitat in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Clean Air Partnership in Toronto, Environment Hamilton, and the Alternative Commuting and Transportation Office at McMaster University. He holds 2 degrees in political science, arts and science from McMaster, and a master's degree in planning from Dalhousie. And Molly, who was most recently up on stage with us, Molly has spent the last 10 years working for some of the most progressive mobility organizations in North America, including Biko, an app that rewards people for cycling around cities. U-Bicycle, a dockless bike-sharing company operating on Vancouver Island. In her spare time, she volunteers for the City of Vancouver's Active Transportation Policy Council, where she advises City Council on strategic policies related to walking, cycling, and public transit. So I think you can see why we've selected these subject matter experts as our moderators for today. So thank you for joining us. And I'm going to join you over there. Thank you. So just a couple quick questions to take us back through the day before we leave for the day and find out what some of those key moments were and learnings that you had in each of your sessions. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and see if we can find some of those highlights. We're certainly not going to wrap up the whole day, okay? But just a couple of things to help our colleagues that have been with us through the day take away some of those fine notes back to their operations. So Shirley, why don't we start with you? Right? First session of the day, kicked off strong, good contributions, learning about delivery models from TNC operators. What could you tell us are the 2 or 3 things that you found were good takeaways from your session, the things that would be most immediate that you might suggest transit systems and municipalities take back to their office tomorrow?
I think what resonates to me most is that I think we're all on the same page. The questions that were asked from the group and the questions that I've even asked to whether it was Uber, whether it was to Lyft, or whether it was to planning from Arlington, they were very, very similar, and I think we're all on the same page. And I think it's kind of in that space where it makes you think that everybody's ready. We're ready to move on. We're ready to have that. I mean, we here in Vancouver don't have some of those options, but I think we're all on the same page. I don't think that there's a risk when we think about, you know, that first mile, last mile, or competing with transit. I think we're all on board. I think that we can work together. And so that was really, really clear. And I think that's something that's changed in the last 2 or 3 years. When we first thought about what TNCs are, I didn't even know that acronym existed 2 or 3 years ago. It's, you know, still fairly new. But I think when we look into this room now and we think about it, we've really progressed. So I think that's come clear that we're all there now. We're all on the same page.
Thank you for that. And Teresa, when you think back about your session, big data and the facts around how TNCs are playing into transit and the relationship there, what came away with you for the top 2 or 3 points that you would suggest that transit systems and municipalities take away today?
Thank you. Our discussion talked about not only the big data, but some of the impacts on transit from the ride hailing. And our experience here in Metro Vancouver is that we do have car sharing. It hasn't taken a dent out of our transit ridership. In fact, I think it's complementary. And I think what we learned from our session is that where ride hailing might not be necessarily taking away from transit ridership, it may be creating congestion that we might want to be mindful of, and how to be aware of that and manage that as we go forward, so that we do, as a transit agency, provide the service that customers want, which is what we heard. We want it to be reliable, it must be fast, and it must be frequent. And we can't do any of those things if the buses are stuck in traffic, along with the ride hailing or someone who's car sharing, anyone else who is not able to otherwise be on public transit. One of the highlights I found is thinking about disruptive technology, not in the sense of what it's doing to transportation or whether or not I have a choice, which of course we are all wanting to have more choice, but more about what it will do for land use, in the sense that we now can do more things with that scarce resource that we have. And we all know it, but can we use this as an opportunity to make this new technology be an agent of change? So we can take those parking lots away now. We can reserve that right of way for the highest and best use of moving people and goods. And we can use that curb space and ensure that we're allocating that space appropriately for the uses that we want to have, supporting our economy and making sure people can get to where they need to go to, and that we can deliver goods and services.
Thank you. And Andrew? Am I still on? Okay. Andrew, I'm going to ask the same question of you. We called the session Mobility Management, but it really was about hearing from others that have gone before us and mobility as a service. And so thinking about whether the role of TNCs and transit and plays into that, and what that might mean for us in the Canadian context. What might you say are the 2 or 3 top takeaways you had for your session?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I think the big thing that I really took away from that session was around the role between the public sector and the private sector, and I think that's something that we in North America have really been grappling with on that question, on that file. We heard that the mass market is 9 times bigger than potentially the private car market, and that a lot of the OEMs are getting into that space, seeing that you can actually make potentially quite a bit more money if you're selling individual trips versus a sort of a single asset. So the point was made that mass is here, and that the public sector can either have it done to them, or they can help shape it in the public interest. And so the advice, I think, from all 3 panelists in that 3rd plenary session was that it's important for the public sector to have a public mobility services platform that provides the basic infrastructure for a robust market, an open marketplace of mass providers. And I think Sampo sort of likened it to the public's responsibility is to build the marketplace, to have all of the stalls neatly lined up and in a safe and orderly manner, so that private mass providers can come in and compete in a fair and consistent and open way. And that the public sector is responsible for meeting those public objectives, having housing the data, understanding the traffic and transportation capacity and demand on the system at any time to help actually manage the broader system.
And now, Molly, we spent the better part of the day thinking about TNCs and how they related to transit, and then some broad understanding about what mobility as a service might mean. And then we had an opportunity to talk about new alternative mobility providers as well. What would you say are the top couple of takeaways from the session that you moderated?
I think there are two questions that they were asking themselves. One was, what kind of vehicles do we need, or do the customers need, and how do we make sure that the vehicles are in the right places? And so we heard from Sandra about FAVES, so fleet of vehicles, electric, shared, and then also from Peter with the GTS platform and dynamic shuttles. But with all the new mobility actors, there are some core principles that I think we need to adhere to be part of the public for our cities. And one of them is collaboration is the name of the game. So no matter how new and big shiny object the new mobility transportation is, we need collaboration between public transit, car sharing, TNCs, car sharing. And making sure that we create good public policy to encourage modal shift, but also for public benefit.
Okay, and one last question. So we talked about what are the couple of things that transit systems and municipalities might think about taking away right now. If they've left the room and they missed part of the session, you've given them some of those notes that they might not have had otherwise, in addition to their own. Those were kind of the short-term things that they might go back to their offices with. If you had some recommendation for them to go back to their office and think about longer term, what might they need to be thinking about now to prepare for the future?
Well, in my session, I think what came up was data sharing, and that was pretty apparent with the whole with Uber and with Lyft, and how do we move forward. What was really interesting, I think, is the takeaway of everyone else to be able to sit here and listen to how Arlington does it. I mean, they don't have any public transit. I mean, it's really new. And to be able to have that model and, them going and saying, no, we actually don't want a fixed route. We like what we have. It's been shot down. We don't want to have a public transit system. It's actually really innovative to think about how they did it, how they're moving forward with it, the successes that they're seeing, and everything that they're going to do to move forward. The vehicles that they have dedicated, accessibility, how the app works. So I think they've got a lot of things really right, and I think that for some of us that end up having, and I think I mentioned earlier, that we have service areas that we're now looking at being kind of different and thinking outside the box. We have mayors in the region that are saying, yeah, we don't need a 40-foot bus, maybe we don't need a community shuttle, but we do need something. And how does that work? Our communities are different here. We have a lot of hills, and so how do we end up servicing some of those service areas? And so I think that was really interesting. That was a great takeaway for me, and probably for my colleagues as well. I think for the Ubers and the Lyfts, I think it's interesting. I think it's probably things they've already heard anyway, but the data sharing, I think, is a big piece, and how do we collaborate? Throughout the day, I continue to hear a same type of thought process on, maybe one app. And recently it was at the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, and there was an innovation opportunity for youth. And every single one of them, I think 4 groups came together with an app of collaborating. And it was exactly that same thing. It was on transportation. And they want to see, so these are millennials now. This is what they want. They're asking for it, and they're saying, why can't you do it? So they're not quite understanding that it's not that easy. There's other layers to it. But I think, again, the public is ready. Our users, the groups that we're trying to attract, they're ready for it. So I saw a common theme. I think there's just a few things we really need to, as an industry, collectively work through.
So I think that that comment about the public want it, they're ready for it, was echoed in a number of sessions. And the comment about the data being necessary to make that happen, and Arlington has that figured out at the moment. Teresa, you're working in the big data area right now. When you hear the comments throughout the day about the need for having access to the data, having it being available to transit systems and municipalities, it's being an important part of their planning and one of their assets. As a data expert in the industry, where do you see some of the barriers, and what do you think how we might address those?
That's a very good question. We talk about cars being dirty and they have to be electric and autonomous. Well, we need data is also dirty, and we need to clean it up first, and it needs to be automated. So it's really hard to get data into the hands of decision makers if the transit organizations or mobility providers don't have the skill set to be able to create clean data sets, standardized data, and have them at disaggregated level. I know we talked a lot about aggregation. Disaggregated level enough that we can do machine learning, we can learn about customers in a way that we need to learn about, create data sets that match or mix different data together so we can learn more and create more value. So I think there's a lot of opportunity within transit agencies and other mobility providers, governments in general, to be able to ensure that they are well set up to be able to handle that data and start working with the data that they have now. TransLink has a huge amount of data. We've been collecting data on our buses for ages, but getting into that data and making sense of it can be more challenging if we're not set up to do it. And we now have the Compass data, which is a great opportunity for us to really showcase what we're capable of doing when we can get into the data and learn about our customers more, and use that to improve our services for customers.
And Andrew, kind of along that same line, you're working in this area of mobility management. You're thinking about pilots and how to explore those within TransLink. When you hear the models that were explained in session number 3 for mobility as a service, what comes to mind for you for Canadian Transit as we might think about ourselves moving forward to mobility as a service models?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me is that if we want to really realize the full potential of, I think as Sandra talked about in the last session, FAVEs, the fleets of automated vehicles that are electric and shared, that's a really critical, essential path to go down if we want to leverage automated vehicles in particular in the public interest and make sure that we don't have automated vehicles resulting in dramatically more traffic and sprawl, then that sort of shared fleet model requires mass to really work well. And so mass is actually the key, that we need to get that right now in order to unlock the sort of more positive vision of an automated future. And I think that one of the key things, just in terms of long-term, we all of us have talked about data and building on what Teresa was just saying. I think a takeaway from that session was the need to have data standards and consistency, like the GTFS now, but for all mobility services that are required to be provided in open API by all the mobility service providers in a consistent format. So, and that's sort of one of those key things that's required to enable this open marketplace, and that Finland and the Netherlands have done that by requiring it in national legislation. And so it's not something that's, a small task, and we heard that it's not easy to do if you're just sort of trying to coordinate in an ad hoc fashion between a bunch of different players or providers, that sort of versions of that might emerge in the market, but that to really do it at scale and to be prepared for that more positive automated future, really needs to happen at a larger scale. So I think that's where that call to action, whether it's organizing through CUTA or other bodies through NACTO or TAC, to look at national or North America or international standards to make sure that this is a really actually global market.
So for moderators then, any last reflections that you might want to share? question that I haven't asked?
Well, I was just going to say that definitely from my plenary, also the future, it does seem to be autonomous and shared. And there's tons of great opportunity kind of attracting new riders, so not focusing on the elders or and kids, so opening that up. So wanting to focus on good public policy and then also holding service providers accountable. So if they're not going to share their data, not share in incentives, and ensuring that they're good partners, good neighbors within cities.
I think for me is not to lose sight of who we're doing it for. And I think that public policy is great, and I think that everything has to align, but it's about the customer experience. And I didn't hear that too much today, so I think it would just be, for me, reinforcing a little bit that at the end of the day, we still have a customer to be able to serve, and what is it that they want, and how do we deliver that to them? Because it doesn't matter how much, policy's great, don't hate me. Policy's great, and we need it because it's our backbone. But we need to be able to make sure that all of that still results in something that packages to our customer. And if we don't do that, then they're not going to use it. And so I think that's my takeaway today. I think the conversation's great. I think where everyone's there, like I said, but we just need to keep in mind who we're doing it for.
And in my session, this came up, Sharon Fagan said it, what problem are you trying to solve? What problem do you have? What are you trying to solve? And it's one that we ask ourselves often when we're working, but what problem are you trying to solve? What is your question? Why are you asking for this? And I think that's what is really important to keep sight of. As Shirley just mentioned, we're doing this to serve customers, to create communities, to improve the affordability and equity in this region through mobility, in our case, as a transit agency. And I think that's what what we need to keep hold of is what problems are we trying to solve and ensure that we've got those well articulated and defined so that we can always make sure that what we're providing is trying to meet the values and the outcomes that we've already defined.
Yeah, I'd build on what Teresa just said, that I think with the rapid pace of technological change, almost anything is becoming possible. So we actually have to really be clear about our objectives. We have to ask ourselves, what do we want? And make sure that we're, as especially public sector agencies, as transit authorities and local governments and provincial governments, making sure that we are leveraging all of these new services and technologies in the public interest. One final interesting takeaway, I think, from the third plenary session, this notion that data is obviously, lots of people see data as the new oil, but Sampo suggested trust is even more valuable than data.
I'd like to thank our moderators, and please join me in thanking Andrew, Teresa, Shirley, and Molly.